Hello, well, a very good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you're tuning in from. And I do know this BA community webinar is a truly global one. I mean, I know we always have folks from around the world, but this topic, perhaps because of the time we're in, or perhaps because of the topic itself, does seem to have attracted, well, global interest and quite a lot of interest as well. Really, really popular topic. Now, I'm sure all of us at some point have changed a job, applied for a job. Perhaps you are in the process of transitioning or looking for a different job. And a natural question to ask is, how should I prepare for an interview? Now, if you are in that position of perhaps looking for a job, and particularly if you've been made redundant, you might want to check out the previous webinar that we did, which was about bouncing back from redundancy. But in this webinar, we're going to be specifically talking about interviewing and preparing for your BA interview. And I'm really pleased to say that we have two fantastic panelists with us. We were going to have a third panelist. Unfortunately, Simon Rookledge, who literally, talk about unfortunate timing, he's having broadband issues. He's moving house, I think, and they cut off his broadband a day too early. So Simon would love to be with us, but unfortunately can't today. But we have Saffron House. Saffron is Senior Business Analyst at Ordnance Survey and Professional Development Director at IIBA UK. And we have Michelle Shakesheff, who is Head of Business Analysis at Close Brothers. So Saf, Michelle, thanks very much for being here. A really interesting topic for us to talk about.
Fantastic, yep.
So before we get started, and I will, for those of you that have attended these webinars regularly, you'll know there'll be a mural board rather than a Jamboard this time for us to paste our thoughts into. I will share that in just a minute. But before I do, I'd like to introduce both, or like to invite both of our panelists just to give a bit of an intro and maybe an insight into why this is a topic that you're interested in. So Saffron, if I invite you to go first.
Thank you, Adrian. Yes, so I'm Saffron House, and many of you will have seen me if you are a member of the IIBA, doing regular webinars for them. I've been Director of Professional Development for IIBA UK for almost 2 years, and an active volunteer as well in that for a little while before that. I lead a team at Ordnance Survey, mapping for Britain. I've been there 15 years and I've been a BA 20 odd years now. So I am passionate about professional development, and I feel that when you put yourself forward to take on a role in a new organisation, there could be so many different expectations of what the BA role might be, that one of the key things I think is really having to work out what it is they're looking for. You know, the role can be so broad. So I think that's one of the key things I'll probably end up putting across.
Yeah.
And being a person who's recruited an awful lot of BAs over the last few years, I think I have a sort of insight into the things that work and the things that maybe to avoid. So looking forward to chatting it all through.
Absolutely, that perspective will be so useful. I'm absolutely certain. So Michelle, if I could invite you to go next.
Thanks, Adrian. So I'm Head of Business Analysis at Close Brothers, and as part of that role, I do lots and lots of recruitment. So it feels like I'm forever doing recruitment. And so really, I have a real interest in this webinar because I see lots of BAs, and I'm sure they're really good BAs, but they're not coming across well in interviews. So really, what I would like to do is to sort of share my tips as to when I'm interviewing, what am I looking for, and how can you prepare more effectively for the interview, and get the most from it, because of course, interviews are a two-way process.
Yes.
So what are the things that, as a candidate, that you need to be looking for as well?
Yes, excellent. So fantastic. So lots for us to talk about. So just before we do that, for those of you that are attending live, I am just going to put in the chat a link to the Mural board, and I will then just very briefly navigate to that in case you haven't used Mural before. Just 1 second, let me share my screen. Here we go. So if you haven't used Mural before, when you click on that link, you'll be asked to put your name in, or you can just be, well, it's normally like your anonymous cheetah or anonymous, antelope or something. And what you'll see is basically a blank board. And we're going to do some sort of collective collaborative note taking. So people who perhaps weren't at the webinar can get a quick sneak peek at what's happening. And all you need to do is, like, if you double click, and I can see all of your icons there already, you can just double click, add a note about a particular topic, and we can collectively share our notes as we go along. You can also, if you want to, play around with all the other tools on the sidebar, but that's entirely up to you. But our aim collectively is to kind of capture the key takeaways as we go along. And about halfway through, I will bring the Mural board back. And it's always a little bit terrifying because it's on my other screen over there, so I can't see it until I bring it back, and then we'll see what people have been saying. So excellent. Okay, and also remember, if you are tuned in live, please do ask questions. We'll take as many questions as we can. Don't put those on the Mural board though, because I will absolutely definitely miss them. Put them in the question and answer, the Q&A button at the back, at the bottom, and we'll cover as many of those as we can. So let's get started. And one of the topics that I know is often really high on people's priority list is how to prepare for an interview. So imagine the situation, the CV's got you the foot in the door, but what practical tips do you have for people who are preparing for an interview, perhaps for something they really, really want? So Michelle, what sort of tips would you have?
Okay, so I think the first thing to do is to research the company. So, you can find so much company information, and I don't really say, I don't really expect you to get hold of the company accounts and be able to recite all the numbers, but actually what you're looking for when you're looking at the organization's website is, what are their values? When they have a look at their career pages, what are their existing staff saying about the career opportunities within that organization? Do those values meet your own? So first of all, know the company. And the other thing I would say is absolutely know that job spec back to front, because the job specification gives you a huge amount of information, not only about the kind of tasks that you're going to be expected to fulfill, but also about the kind of people that the organization is looking for. So very often when you look at a job profile, what it will give you is the key responsibilities of the role. And that's all of the kind of analysis type of work that you would be expected to do. So for each of those things, you can draw back on your previous experience. So for example, if they're saying business process modeling, actually think back about when you've done that, and actually what were the standards that you used? Did you use a tool? Did you use a modeling notation, for example? But also then have a look at the competencies, because for each of the competencies, what the organization is telling you is what kind of person they're looking for. Yeah. So if, for example, you have it says you have a competency of teamwork, you can prepare really well for that, because you can think in advance, okay, what was a really brilliant example of when I worked as part of a team? And you can prepare those sorts of questions. Yeah. And actually from the, sorry, Adrian, for the interviews that I do, people get really strong business analysts get really caught out by competency questions. And I think one of the things which is really hard is trying to come up with a scenario or a situation just off the top of your head, particularly if you've got, 20, 30 years of experience to trawl through, trying to come up with a situation from your experience, in the pressure of an interview is quite hard. So you can prepare by thinking about those in advance.
Yeah, it's really interesting what you say there, Michelle. And a tip I was given, gosh, a long time ago, which has always stuck with me, is a very, very experienced person who taught me a lot. Essentially said a really great way of doing it is to create a table. So deconstruct whatever information they've given you, job spec, people spec, whatever, and for each point have a story or an example. And I've always really liked that idea. It's probably the systematic analysis part of me of breaking it down and having a story to tell about each part, because that sort of, as you say, I guess it helps prepare it, have it front of mind.
Absolutely. And in actual fact, I had a candidate recently who did just that, and actually sent through.
Oh,
so
wow.
She did it in an Excel spreadsheet, and she sent it through ahead of the interview. And I have to say, she's now a colleague.
Wow, there we go. That's a great tip. So, Saffron, anything you'd add?
Yeah, so great points from Michelle. Things that have come to my head are things such as just being able to talk through the basics. Some of the questions that we use are very much sort of an open questions of what's the role of the BA, or what's the BA process? How could you describe your process as a BA? And those sorts of things can throw you if you haven't just thought about some of those basics. And don't forget that there are models out there that you can use. There's BCS models, there's IBA models, and those could be really helpful. And then thinking also a little bit about the language that you're picking up from the research, as Michelle has suggested, so that when you talk about a particular a project lifecycle stage, for example, that you talk about it in the terms of that organisation. That can be really helpful. And then also I was thinking about getting your own questions in order. Start to think about, not just, as you said at the beginning, Adrian, that this is an interview of sort of two halves. You're also trying to find out what you need to know about that organisation. How big a practice is it? Who will you be working with? What's their culture like? Those sorts of questions, so that you don't come away thinking you're not really sure what you might be sort of signing up to.
Yeah, and that's a really interesting one, the two-way element of it. And I suppose this is probably a good place to perhaps ask the curveball question: what's a really, really bad question for a candidate to ask? Or not a bad, but one that doesn't inspire confidence. And I'll just give an opinion, and you two can tell me whether you think that this is right. Like, I always think, like a good question, or in my view, a good question is, what's the biggest problem your practice is facing right now? Or in your industry, what's the biggest strategic driver which is causing change, type of thing? I wouldn't consider personally a question like, what training will I get when I join to be... And that's not to say I don't think that people shouldn't have aspirations, but to me, I think, are you just here to are you going to get the training and leave? So, I mean, Saffron, Michelle, would you agree with that, or am I being harsh?
No, you're not being at all harsh, Adrian. And actually, I have to say, I hear that question so many times, and actually, my heart kind of sinks, because I take it very much in the as you suggested. It's just, and particularly if candidates on their CV have got no ongoing professional development, and they've got no existing qualifications, and so they're actually, then they ask about training, it kind of lands particularly badly. But I absolutely get that it's a really valid question to ask. So I would recommend, if that's an area of interest for you, why don't you just rephrase the question? So you can say something like, my professional development is really important to me. I'd love to get some BA qualifications. How might you help me with that?
Yeah.
Because what you're doing is, that way you're taking ownership of it, but the organisation is helping and supporting you. Which is a very different question from saying, what are you going to do for me? Yeah.
Or I'm just springboarding from that, or maybe even, there have been some constraints which have meant that I haven't been able to progress this up until now. Can we create the opportunity, or something along those lines? So Saffron, anything you'd add?
Yeah, I think as you said, Adrian, maybe it's not just the facts. So you might say, well, how many BAs, who would I be working with? But also some more of those sort of open questions. So not the closed questions where you just get an answer. Questions that will cause the interviewer to think. So maybe sort of questions like, how do you judge the effectiveness of your BAs? That sort of question, or how do you judge the effectiveness of your BA practice? Or how would you rate it even? Because it can be extremely surprising if you walk into an organisation and actually you've assumed there's a certain level of maturity, and then if you ask that sort of question, you might learn, well, actually, we've only really established ourselves as a practice 6 months ago, and we're on the beginning of a journey. So I think open questions are really helpful.
Yeah. We've got a couple of comments from Harpal, actually, which I think are worth bringing in at this point. So Harpal says that he likes to use mind maps for breaking down the job spec. I think that's a great idea. I'd never thought of that, which is weird because I use mind maps all the time. But great way of doing it. And he also says that he likes to ask why the BA position is being recruited for. He says, I think it's a fair question to ask and to better understand the how and the why the vacancy arose. Again, I'd never thought of that, but that's really interesting because it could be, well, we're expanding or we've had a reorganization. And, knowing you're walking into a reorganization is really, really interesting.
Just a word of warning on that one though, Adrian, because very often organisations do recruit because there's attrition, and actually that's not a bad thing. People move on to other organisations, they move for all sorts of reasons, and so if you're in an interview situation and you ask that very question and the answer comes back, it's because someone's left. How do you interpret that? So it kind of puts you in a situation where you just think, actually, is it just one person that's left? Are loads of people left? So again, I'm not sure that the question actually tells you what you really want to know.
That's true. It could be misleading. You could draw misleading conclusions from that, couldn't you?
Yes. Yeah. So you could ask something like, how is your BA practice growing? For example, something along that kind of line. So think about, what do you really want to know?
Which is a BA type question, isn't it? It's coming back to the problem we're trying to solve type of. Okay, so a couple of comments from Araceli here, who says that this links to a 3-minute speech that she gave at the BA open mic, where we can have a list of experiences to draw from to match with each line of the job spec, which I think, again, really, really interesting point there. And she also says that good answers are in challenge, action, result format. So that's not a format I'm familiar with, but challenge, action, result. I think I'd need to write that down and get my head around it. I'm absolutely sure that Ara is right because she always is, but
and very often we use the STAR technique, so that's another very common technique, which is situation, task, action and result. So again, I had a quick look at some of the online sort of interview questions, and they recommend the STAR technique. And actually, what I would say is, I was doing some work with some colleagues a few months ago, and somehow or another the STAR technique came up, and we said, oh, we'll have a go. And we said, oh my goodness, it's really hard. Oh my gosh, it's really hard to do. So we actually all said, gosh, we better get practicing at this. So we spent the next 10 days, we all emailed each other one STAR technique every day, just to kind of get us used to doing it. And I think what makes it really, really hard, and this is something that kind of BAs fall down this trap all the time, is that they spend so much time talking about the project.
Yes.
And then they've got like 2 words to tell the interviewer what they did.
Yes.
And it's a bit like a bad joke, that actually it's, if you're going to spend 20 minutes setting up your joke, you've really got to be confident that your punchline is going to pay off. So where I would recommend that you practicing the STAR technique can really help you is that you can get across the situation in 1 or 2 sentences.
Yeah, and I mean, that's another really important point, isn't it, Michelle? And I know it's one that I struggled and struggle with, but I do think good BAs say we. They talk about we, but when interviewing, you really want to hear what the candidate did.
Yeah.
So, if it were, I should say I, or that, I was part of a team that achieved this, and my contribution towards that was this. And of course, it was a team effort. Like, we couldn't work, and the teamwork was an important part of it. But the specific, unique thing that I brought to it was X, Y, and Z.
Yeah,
and
definitely.
I think that's something that, going back to the preparation, takes a lot of thinking through to pitch that just right.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think I was just going to say, if you're not, and often I think BAs often are of a certain type who do have either naturally, as you say, Adrian, talk like that, or have trained themselves to talk about in third person. The project was this, and this is what happened. It really is helpful just to practice saying it out loud. I did this.
Yeah.
Now this is the situation, as you say, Michelle, use the STAR technique, but then to say, and my contribution was this. This is what I achieved. This is what I brought to the party. Not just I was involved in a workshop that achieved this. In the workshop, I planned the workshop. I met the stakeholders. I decided how what process we were going to go through, and practice saying it out loud. So that it doesn't feel weird if you're not used to doing that.
Absolutely. So just pivoting to a slightly different topic, because we've talked about researching, which I think is so important, and there's so much out there online, and and with LinkedIn, you may well know someone if who's worked there, and you can, if you know them well, you can give them a call and just ask for some insight. But any view on how much is too much? Because you do sometimes get people sort of cold contacting you on LinkedIn or cold calling, and that to me always feels a little bit too far. How much is, when does fair research become stalking? Which is
yeah, I think, in my view, I think it's absolutely fine to do your research and to make contact with the recruiter who you've been speaking to. Yeah. So that might be a direct recruiter, or it could be you might be using an agency. I would shy away from sort of reaching out to the interviewer before you've had your interview.
Yes.
Because it's a bit intrusive, and it's a bit sort of be my best friend, isn't it, really? So I think, I've had lots of candidates, both successful candidates and unsuccessful ones, who have reached out to me on LinkedIn after the interview, and that's absolutely fine. I'm open to that. But beforehand, I think it's a bit presumptuous. It's a bit as if you're trying to influence the jury, I think.
Yeah, and creates a conflict of interest, really, doesn't it, in a way?
Yeah, I agree. I think if you've got professional contacts who are at that organisation, then you leverage them. But as you say, approaching anyone who's actually recruiting wouldn't feel right.
Yeah.
Okay,
so one thing I see a lot on LinkedIn, and I even read an article recently, and the article was something like top 10 interview questions asked at BA interviews. And I read through it and I thought, I can't ever imagine a serious BA manager asking a single one of these questions. Because it was questions like, when you're drawing a use case diagram, which way should an arrow point if it's an extend? And like, just nobody, I mean, I'm not saying that's unimportant, but I don't think that's a that's not going to get you a job. That's not the sort of thing so how can people prepare for interview questions, or is it possible to prepare for interview questions?
Yeah, I think it is. And actually, I have to say, my kind of view with sort of BA techniques is, I will only ever ask about the techniques that you have told me that you've used. So if it's on your CV, it's fair game. And I may well ask, it's very common for me to ask a situation like, oh, you said you did a use case diagram. Just explain to me, what does that look like? What are the elements? So that type of question. I'm going to ask you about the techniques that you've told me you've used. And I'm only going to ask about the ones that you've told me you've used. So woe betide you if you can't describe them to me.
Yes.
And I think it's really sad that I kind of do have to validate what's on CVs, because there's a bit, some CVs now, it's almost they're kind of cramming in as many business analysis techniques as they possibly can.
Yes.
And actually, what I think you're kind of in the danger zone there, because the more that you give me to play with, the more questions I have to ask you. So you absolutely have only put on your CV the techniques you have absolutely used, and expect to be asked about them.
I 100% agree, and I don't know if you see this, Michelle, but I've seen CVs when I've been involved with recruitment where I think people have been like keyword stuffing. There's a section with lots of techniques, and so a question I'll often ask and this will often be in a pre-screening telephone. Well, back in the day when we had physical interviews, it would have been a pre-screening telephone interview. So lots of interesting techniques here. Are these all techniques you've used, or are they just techniques you know about? Oh, you've used them all. Fantastic. So I see you've got Anthony's triangle and the Zachman framework on there. Can you give me a practical example of when you've used them? Well, but then that very quickly, for me, I think, well, if I can't trust the candidate on that, then that creates a seed of doubt.
Yeah.
So
just to throw in my thoughts, I think the interview questions that you'll be asked can vary so much depending on what kind of BA. As I said, it's such a broad church of what kind of BA the organisation might be looking for. And even though you've looked at the job spec, it can still be quite open to interpretation. So I think it is wise to, though, prepare for what might be some of the obvious questions, and an internet search may give you some hints, but also know your strengths and your examples. So be prepared. Think through the work that you've done, think through the work that you've been doing recently, and what is it you brought to the party. So when those questions come up, you've had that think, you've got sort of fresh in your mind a range of examples to choose from. So even if you can't control the questions, you've got more insight into what your answers might be.
Yeah, it's I've quoted this so regularly recently, and I can't remember which presentation it was, and I think it was I don't do sports. It was a sports person keynote at a conference who talked about teacup, which stands for thinking clearly under pressure. And there's something about, and I remember decades ago, a polar explorer called Alan Chambers, MBE, saying, never take your body where your mind hasn't been. And I think a job interview is a good example of that. Mentally rehearse it. If the first time you're going through that thinking process is in the room where you're being interviewed, it's not going to end well, or it's unlikely to end well. So, okay, let's take some questions. So, a friend we all know, Corinne. Hello, Corinne.
Oh, hello,
Corinne. Corinne says, what are your views on asking job candidates to do a presentation during the interview?
Yeah, I do ask for an interview, actually, but I do ask candidates to prepare an interview in advance, and then deliver it in the interview. I mean, I really like something like a presentation or a case study, or that type of exercise. I think it shows you a lot about the candidates. And interestingly, I asked for a presentation at first interview. And I can remember one recruitment consultant saying to me, candidates don't mind doing a presentation at second interview, but they don't really want to do it at the first. And I said, well, actually, if any BA who is not willing to get on their feet is not a BA that's going to do well here, Yeah. So actually, it tells us a lot about the candidates. The reason why I do it is because I'm quite mean. So I kind of give you a really big topic and 10 minutes, because what I want to see is how did you approach the brief? How did you break it down? How did you interpret it? Did you do some research? But also, how did you draw on your own experiences? How have your own values influenced what you said? So I can find out a lot about the candidate from a presentation. And of course we do, as BAs, we have to command the room. Yeah. So actually seeing how BAs present, is very, very insightful. Do they stand up? Do they lean back in their chair? Do they read from the slides? All of those things can give you an insight as to how they might do the job. Yeah, that kind of presence, that gravitas, which is so important. So, Saffron, what's your view on, I suppose, presentations or even, scenarios or wider activities?
Yeah, in our recruitment at Ordnance Survey, we do always ask for a presentation. For the more junior levels, we ask for the presentation and give them the brief up front. And as you say, Michelle, it's not so much can they draw beautiful PowerPoints, and do they have that kind of, and not even so much the content, the fact, what you're looking for is how they deliver it. Can they think on their feet? Can they explain what they've put there? And if it's presented in some kind of if it's presented well as well, because we do have to have those sort of abilities to drill down, to come back up, to explain things, you know, so there is an element of it making sense as well that you're looking for. And then with our more senior roles, what we used to do, and we haven't found a way around this yet in the virtual world, is we used to ask them to do a sort of whiteboard talk through unprepared. So we throw them a question and would ask them to write on the whiteboard. And that, again, it was more about that. Can you think on your feet? How do you respond? And just simple questions, not necessarily a challenging question, but, you know, a simple question might be, so could you workflow how you might go how you might deliver a workshop, you know, what are the steps you might go through, that sort of thing. And so I think presentations probably are to be expected, and the key thing is that what people are looking for is, can you answer the question that was set out?
Yeah. Can
you present your information in a logical way, not only in the presentation but also in the way you speak as well?
Yeah.
So I think they should be expected.
And also another aspect that is quite telling as well is that, you know, actually, if you've been given a time limit, stick to it.
Yeah.
Yes.
You know, so, you know, we say 10 minutes. Well, I've had some candidates who've spoken for 25 minutes and have been blissfully unaware of the time. You know, so that in itself sort of demonstrates that actually that candidate is not really, you know, self-disciplined. So if they can't deliver a presentation in the time that they've been allocated, actually, are they going to deliver their project in the time they've been allocated?
And editing is such an important and hard and very, very hard skill in so many spheres. So, okay, let's just have a look at the mural board. This is always the terrifying part where we'll see, oh, good, there are some things on it. And actually, just in case anyone's joined a little bit late, because I know sometimes people do join a little bit late, I will put a link to this in the chat as well. And do carry on, keep adding to this. We'll have a nice set of shared notes at the very, very end. I've temporarily lost the chat, the chat box, but I'll put that back when I can next find the chat box. So let's see what we have on here. So we have lots of people adding. So we've got lots about the prep. Researching the company is essential. Have multiple engagement with various domains and have an agile mindset. Be rounded. Know the job spec from back to front. Really know the job spec. Have concrete working examples of competencies. Ask those open-ended questions. Stick to the time given with the presentation. Ask questions like, is your BA practice growing? So yes, we've got lots and lots of stuff on there. So excellent. Well, do keep adding to that. Do keep adding to that if you are with us live. I will now just add that in the chat box, just in case you joined a little bit later. There is a link to the shared mural. Great. Okay, so let's just have a look, because we've got loads of questions coming in. So Rushma asks, are there any tips for contractors versus permanent BA opportunities? I suppose springboarding from that and adding to that is, you know, would a permanent BA be expected or interviewed differently from a contract BA? So any views on that?
Yeah, I would say very much so. So with a permanent, when you're interviewing for a permanent staff member, what you want is somebody who is not only are they going to be a fabulous business analyst, but also they're going to be a fabulous part of your organization. So that kind of values fit is so important, because that person is going to come in, they're going to do a fantastic job on their project or the change that they're working on, but also they're going to make a contribution beyond their immediate role as well. So they're going to be a fully paid up card carrying member of the organization, and you want somebody who's really going to buy into that and make that contribution beyond their role. With a contractor, in my view, it's much more transactional, because that person is coming in to do a specific job of work and then they'll go again. So that kind of values fit and that kind of matching is less important. You know, I mean, you would never bring anybody into your organisation who sort of had an outward conflict with your organisation's values, but actually you don't focus on it as much. So, for example, for contractors, I will do a one-stage interview, which is much more technically focused than for permanent staff members.
Saffron, would you agree with
that? Well, my sort of first reaction was probably not as strong as Michelle's, in as much as the interview sort of template of questions that we use is the same, but obviously we adapt our template for every vacancy anyway. So there is a difference, but probably not as I would be also looking for someone who's going to fit in the culture, fit in the team, contribute to some degree to the team. Sometimes we do need our contractors to help bring on less senior members of staff as well. So we are looking for some of those contributions. So maybe not quite as differentiated as Michelle's thinking, in my experience.
Yeah, interesting. Okay, so so subtly different. It depends on the context. Depends on.
Yeah, it does. Yeah.
So here's a really interesting question from Barry, and this is one of those questions where I'd love to know what experience led to this question, and I can imagine. I think I can imagine what the experience was here. But Barry asks, any tips for interviewers or questions from recruiters who do not understand the BA role? And it does have to be said, and I know recruitment consultants get a bad rep, but there are some very, very good ones out there. There are some very, very good ones out there. But sometimes, and I'm guessing this might be what's happened in Barry's case, the first barrier, or not barrier, the first stage is with a recruitment consultant who may or may not understand the role. So what if they don't understand the role? So any
So I do work in partnership with a recruitment consultant, and actually I'm fully aware of the fact that it's not their job to understand business analysis. It's my job to understand business analysis. So the way that I work with them is that I give them screening questions, a couple of questions which relate to the sort of the BA experience, and I say, actually, just write down what the candidate says. I don't expect you to evaluate whether the candidate's given you the right answer or not. So just write down verbatim what the candidate says, and then actually that's fine. I can then assess what the candidate said. So that's sort of one angle to it. The other kind of angle, I'm going to flip this on its head a little bit though, is that actually as business analysts, it is our role, it's our job to be able to explain complex techniques to non-technical people. If we, as a business analyst, if we cannot get a recruitment consultant to understand what we've done, then I would kind of say maybe we could have a look at how we're positioning it ourselves. Are we phrasing it in the right way? Because we explain really complex things to people who are not technical all day long. That's what the job is.
Yeah,
I would agree with that. I think if you can't, if an organisation is using a recruitment agency that doesn't understand their job, then I'd be a bit concerned about working for that organisation, because I'd been thinking, as you say, Michelle, they haven't been able to articulate what it is they're looking for. And in my experience, we have a limited list of agents that we work with, and if there are issues with the kind of people they're passing our way, we deal with that very quickly. And so I don't think it is a barrier for my organisation. And as I say, if it does seem to be a barrier, then you maybe don't want to work for that organisation, because they don't know the job, and their business analyst practice haven't recognised that and haven't been able to position it as they should.
Yeah.
I can offer one alternative here, though, Barry, because I know that it does happen. So I work very closely with recruitment consultants. I know that some organisations say, it's a cast of thousands. So one thing that you might find, if you do find you're in the situation that you've been asked a question and you're answering the question, but the person at the recruitment consultancy doesn't understand what you're telling them because they're not a business analyst, one of the things you might want to consider is to say, why don't I email you my answers, and then you can forward it on to the hiring manager.
Yes. Great tip there. And it's interesting, isn't it? Because another element to this, and I've no idea whether this still happens, because this happened to me, actually, Corinne, who's on the call, would know exactly when this happened, because Corinne hired probably the worst hiring decision Corinne ever made. We worked together in a previous life, and the organisation that Corinne worked for at the time, I really wanted to work for, and I'd applied for a more senior role and hadn't got it, and then a slightly less senior role came up, and I really wanted it, and I applied through the agent but then another agent contacted me about it, and I said, well, I've already applied through this other agent, and they said, but they're not on the approved suppliers list. All they can be doing is sending your CV unsolicited because they've seen it somewhere else. So I only got that job because there was there are sometimes some shaky tactics out there. I don't think it's as widespread as LinkedIn would have us believe, but actually, maybe if they can't answer the questions, it's because they haven't actually got the authority to place the job, which is a worry.
I think that can happen.
I mean, I think on the whole, I think the recruitment consultants sort of behave very well. But one of the things that I always tend to do is if I see a role which is being advertised by a recruitment consultant, I would typically then go onto that organisation's website to see whether or not they are actually, do they have a role? And that isn't to say that, that I then wouldn't apply through the agency, because I think that agencies, they do a fantastic job of helping candidates to understand what the organisation's looking for, and and what that organisation's likes, what they can be incredibly supportive. And of course, a recruitment consultant will not only deal with that organisation, they'll know perhaps other roles which are coming up in other organisations. So they have their place. And I think try to get to know 2 or 3 recruitment consultants who can act for you. Because again, it's all about building relationships. If it's a transactional sort of relationship that you have with a recruitment consultant, then actually that consultant's never going to get to know what your strengths are and what you're really looking for.
Yes.
So it's about building those relationships, and Saff, I'm sure that you find all the time that you have maybe 2, 3, 4 calls from recruitment consultants every week, pretty much.
Yeah.
And and I do too. And many of the sort of the BAs would also have sort of cold calls from recruitment consultants. And what I would say is, don't just put the phone down or refuse to answer back, or refuse to take the call. Think about, okay, how can I build a relationship with maybe a couple of recruitment consultants, so that actually they really get to know me. And I speak to several recruitment consultants that I've never used, but I've spoken to them regularly for over 10 years.
Yeah. And
that's it, isn't it? It's about building a relationship, and you don't know where it will go. It might be that actually you end up hiring through them, or they, but I suppose, if all of a sudden, heaven forbid, someone's made redundant, then you're in panic mode, then, and you're scattergunning. So just a slight change of trajectory here, or a slight pivot. So Nuruddin asks, Nuruddin's interested in tips for answering the question, tell me about yourself, which is, I don't know. I see that as a bit of a lazy question to ask in an interview, if I'm honest. But any tips on that?
Yeah, I think that's a horrible question. Actually, I think it's horribly unfair. So given that kind of question, I would tend to give perhaps a very, very brief potted history of my career, and then perhaps add on a few personal details. Do you have a family? What do you enjoy doing, for example? But it is a horribly lazy question.
I think I would put some boundaries around it, and one would presume it's a sort of question that might be asked at the beginning as a sort of, let's get to know each other sort of question. If I was asked that question, which I wouldn't ask it, tell me about yourself, I would say, in what context are you looking to sort of understand my BA career, a potted history of that, or are you asking, what kind of personality am I? Or I'd ask a question back, probably just to find out what it is, just to put some edges around it. Would be my response.
And you can treat it almost as an introduction. So if you were at a networking event, for example, and you walked up to somebody you didn't know, what would you say to them? So you can just literally, if you treat it as an introduction, it becomes a little less daunting. So if the question were rephrased and somebody said, "Oh, introduce yourself,"
yes,
actually that's something we all feel really comfortable with. Yeah. So maybe just in your head, if they say, "Tell me about yourself," interpret that to mean introduce yourself, and then you can relax, because that's something that we all feel comfortable with.
And I think it's always a good thing to have as well, and I know Corinne has done a work on this, is your sort of BA brand. I think it's really good to have what's your purpose as a BA, sort of prepared answer, because it really helps you. Because if your purpose as a BA is a certain, if you've identified that, and you're looking at this job and it's absolutely a match, you really want to get that across. And if it isn't a match, then you need to explore just how far out that is, because either your skills aren't going to fit, and maybe you get the opportunity to grow into an area that you wanted to grow into, or your skills won't fit, and actually you're not going to enjoy that job because what they feel they want from their BA is not what you feel is your power. So I think a little bit of preparation of your tagline, your strap line,
absolutely,
is good.
And it is sort of interesting, isn't it? Because sometimes realizing that you're not a fit saves a lot of stress in the long run, really, doesn't it? So, a question from someone who, and I can understand from the context of the question why they have decided to ask this anonymously. And if anyone is on and you want to ask anonymously, if you hit the anonymous button, literally none of us can see who's asked it. They say, if you've had a fairly large employment gap, say 1 year, and this was down to experiencing a bout of depression, would you be honest about this or cover it up with something more positive? That's a really tricky one. I mean,
yeah, that is really tricky. I mean, what I do think, if I'm perfectly honest, is that the kind of people having gaps in their CVs, these days, that is no great shakes, because careers are not the same shape that they were before. If you think back 20 years, you joined an organization at entry level when you left school or you left a university, and you then stayed in that organization. You worked your way up through the ranks, and it was a very traditional career path. And actually, those days are gone. So people have much more fluid careers now. They move in and out of different roles. They might have a period of employment. They might have a period of self-employment. They might take time out of their career for whatever reason. So what I would think is, having a gap in your CV is not the problem that it used to be. So that's the first thing, is don't worry if you've got a gap in your CV. Actually, these days people do all sorts of things. And the second thing is, it's for you to decide what you feel comfortable in saying. Okay, so having somebody who has had ill health, whatever kind of ill health, for me is not a blocker to employment.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, but it's your story. You tell it how you want and how you feel comfortable, and I think that's really important. And one of the things that I think you're going to find out, if you say, actually, I was off for a period of time with depression, the response that you get is going to tell you an awful lot about whether that's an organization you want to work for.
Absolutely right. I was just thinking that, and I think that's an important point as well, isn't it, Michelle? Is that well, and this is I guess a personal view, but if someone has depression, that I take the view they have as much right to be off as someone who's broken their leg. I mean, you know, there's a recovery process, and I'm not equating those two things. You know, I said that slightly flippantly. And you know, I don't think, I think there's far less judgment. I mean, my own observations, there's far less judgment over depression and other mental health concerns than there was even 10 years ago. I mean, Saffron, would you agree with that there's perhaps not?
I would agree. I think what I tend to see, though, is that people don't mention that on their CVs and on their applications. You do see, as Michelle said, you do see gaps a lot, and what you often see is people will give a reason why they will say that there was something they were doing, and potentially that is to disguise an issue in their life that took some time to recover from. People might put something like renovating a property, see that kind of thing come up quite a lot, and it may be that that those gaps that I've seen on people's CVs, they have been covering over or glossing over what actually was going on. If they'd presented themselves and said, time off through being with mental health challenges, I don't think it would make any difference, just the same as if it said time off to look after a sick relative or do some house renovations. But I can understand why people might not want to put it on there. The key thing is, have you got the skills? Can you show that you're the right person for the job, and can you do that through the interview? And I don't think that you should expect an employer to ask, why did you have that time off? So you shouldn't need to expect that. Just be prepared to answer the questions, to sell the best parts of yourself as a BA, whether or not you had that time out, I think.
And actually, just a sort of final point on that, with gaps in CVs, employers are not there to judge whether you spent your time wisely, or whether you did something that was, whether you pursued a suitable hobby, for example. Why employers ask that question is because what they want to find out is, did you have another job that you haven't put on your CV?
Yes.
That's what the concern is.
Yes.
So if, as long as you say, I wasn't working, that's fine. It doesn't matter. Actually, if you weren't working, I don't really care what you were doing, to be perfectly honest, because what I'm concerned about is, did you have a job that went so badly, you've excluded it?
Absolutely.
That's what the concern is.
And I mean, just a final ponder point for whoever asked that question, because I mean, I don't know if that was the motivation for asking this question, but we also should remember the Equalities Act covers applicants, and if they feel they've been discriminated against because of a gap through mental, through a mental health complaint, then that employer definitely isn't it isn't acting fairly, I wouldn't think so.
Yeah, absolutely. But employers are not there to judge, and in gap, the days when you were expected to sort of to work solidly for 35 years without taking any time off, it's a really old-fashioned view. It doesn't really happen anymore.
Absolutely. So we've got so many questions. I think we'll cover as many of them as we possibly can. Saffron, this one might be one that you've got a perspective on, actually. Do you have any tips for first-time BAs with qualifications but not much experience outside of apprenticeship? Because do you have apprentices, Saff, at your place?
We do.
Yeah. What would your view on that one?
So at Ordnance Survey, when we're looking for BAs who are going to apply for our apprenticeship scheme, what we're looking for there is examples of activities that they have done, or achievements that they have done that show that sort of potential. So, for example, are they good at building relationships with stakeholders? Have they taken ownership of a process issue and tried to resolve that, as well as do they have some understanding of what the BA role is, and do they understand some of those fundamentals of software development, for example? So I think that there are parallels. If you often I'm definitely a believer that BAs are kind of born. So there was probably things that you have done that have drawn you to want to be a BA, and you're probably halfway there if you've decided that's what you want to do. And so I would imagine that you can find examples of the typical BA activities that will help you to get through, and to show that you've got the knowledge and you've actually got more experience than perhaps you'd even recognise yourself.
Definitely. So, Michelle, anything to add?
Yeah, what I would say is that if you're sort of a business analyst and you're coming to the end of your apprenticeship and you're looking for your next move, for example, then what I would say is that, as long as you're pitching for the appropriate role and the appropriate salary, you have a huge amount to offer, because that business analyst apprenticeship scheme is absolutely top notch. That scheme has been put together by practicing business analyst managers. It benefits. It's got 18,000.
Such as yourself.
Indeed, it's got £18,000 worth of training and support that's thrown in. So it is an absolute top-notch scheme. So if you have come through a business analyst apprenticeship scheme, congratulations, you have had the very best start to your career. And in terms of your next move, actually, I often look at business analysts who've got a couple of years experience, and look to kind of grow them through to the next stage of their career. So just be sensible in terms of what you're looking for. If you've done an apprenticeship, you've had 6 months hands-on experience, and then you think you're a senior business analyst, I'd say you're probably not. So just be sensible.
Definitely. Just a clarification, I think Nuruddin's question about the tell me about yourself, when we were talking about that being a lazy question, I think it's important that we're referring to the interviewer being lazy.
Yes.
There, I think from Nuruddin's responses that may have been misinterpreted, but we weren't in any way, Nuruddin, suggesting you were lazy. Lazy on behalf of the interviewer. So those responses there, yes. Okay, so let's pivot slightly, because quite a few questions are about virtual, because of course people are presenting virtually and are interviewing virtually right now. So any differences, any tips for virtual interviews?
I think that we're all pretty Zoom friendly now, aren't we? We're all quite used to it. As an interviewer, I'm always very, very conscious of the fact that the candidates that I'm talking to, they're inviting me into their home. I am not expecting to see a sterile office environment behind them. So what I would say is absolutely don't worry about that. So don't worry, don't think that you have to have a kind of newsreader background behind you, because you don't. It is your home. So actually we're quite relaxed. One of the interesting things which has come up, I think, through kind of virtual interviewing and doing it all online, is what's the dress code these days? So you might want to, because actually, if you were going to the office, you'd be all suited and booted.
Yeah.
Whereas actually being suited and booted and sitting on the end of your own bed feels really strange. So one of the things I would, at this time, I would urge you to say to the kind of either the recruitment consultant or the person who's arranging the interviews, is just ask them what the dress code is.
Yes.
Just so that you can kind of get it right.
And if in doubt, I think look smarter than this.
Yeah.
Slightly smarter.
Adrian, you could have made an effort. Look at yourself.
Look more like Michelle and a little bit less like me. If you can't work it out, then I think you're right. Just ask if you can. If not, just go for be presentable as if you were going to an interview. I think would be, if you can't find out.
Absolutely.
Yeah. But I would say don't panic, because these days things like the tech not working or you didn't connect first time around, my goodness me, we are all in the same boat with that. So we are so much more relaxed, and I'm quite relaxed. I very much like to see people's pets.
Yes. I quite like the convention that any pet that comes on screen has to be introduced. I think that's quite a good rule. But I've just caught sight of the time, and I know we could carry on for hours. And apologies to anyone whose question we haven't answered. just before we finish, like in a word or a few words, what would your biggest takeaway, your biggest piece of advice, the biggest thing you'd want people to take away? So, I mean, Saffron, your biggest takeaway for people to take away from this session?
Excuse my son playing the trumpet in the background as well. I would say my biggest takeaway is that knowing what you are, what kind of BA are you, and what are your strengths as a BA, what is important to you, what direction do you want your career to go in, and where is it you definitely don't want to go, because if you're really clear about that, you probably have already used that to help you narrow down and apply for a particular job. But even when you go into that interview, there could be a lot of scope for you to push yourself or present yourself as someone who's got those strengths, and maybe appeal in a way that wouldn't have happened if you hadn't thought of yourself in that way and your direction in your career.
Definitely excellent, sage advice there as always. Michelle, anything to add?
Yeah, for me, I think I'm going to keep it really simple and say, don't lie. You can honestly, you can blag your way through the interview, but if you've done that, you're then going to have to blag your way through the job. Yeah. Why would you do that to yourself?
Yeah.
So
through that stress.
Yeah, exactly. So be honest. Yeah.
Fantastic. And so Saffron, Michelle, if people want to get in touch with you, is LinkedIn the best way for people to connect? Or
yes, yeah, more than happy. Yeah.
Excellent. Okay, well, Saffron, Michelle, thank you so much for taking time out. It's a really popular webinar. We had lots of people live. I'm sure even more people will be watching the recording. So a massive thank you for taking time out to have this conversation. Massive thank you to everyone who tuned in live, or indeed who is watching the recording. If we didn't get to your question, I apologise. There are just far too many for us to cover this time. Just a few things to mention to you. So first of all is we've got a couple of upcoming events that might be of interest to you. And if you're live, I'm going to put them into the chat right now. First, coming up on the 14th of December, there's the next live stream episode of BA Fringe. If you've not seen that before, it's more like a TV show than a webinar with multiple guests, and it's streamed live, which is always terrifying. And the agenda's TBC, but it's very likely to include a topic of getting up to speed in a new role from a contractor. Although equally that's going to be relevant for if you're permanent. Virtual facilitation with a little bit of conflict resolution and how to do that virtually, and BA job seeking and more. So a bit of a theme in December about job seeking. Also then 2 days later on the 16th of December, there is the BA open mic, which is a lot of fun. You can take the virtual stage for 3 minutes and talk about absolutely anything you like. Always good fun if you can do that. Keeps us connected as a community in this weird virtual world that we are in. So with that, thank you everyone. Thanks, Saf and Michelle. Enjoy the rest of your evenings, and well, see you all next time.
Thanks, Adrian.
Thank you, Adrian.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.